Hey all. So really nice we are all prepared, said and done. Hope you grabbed yourself a nice cup of coffee or a drink during this nice Pechakusha session. So what we made notice of yesterday was that there is a shift from physical space to virtual space. And also when you want to reach a good point of designing or planning, you need to have a back and forth between both spaces, virtual and physical space. Today, we started the day with a really nice presentation of Thijs Turel and Serbi Agrawal from the AMS Institute. They showed us how to going back and forth with some practical tools. And afterwards, we had a really nice workshop. And yeah, part one is already done. And part two, we will still have after this Pechakusha session. So our speakers of the Pechakusha session and the discussion, thanks for being here. So let's start with the ladies. We have Fiona Zish and Irene Luque Martin here, and Vamsi Krishna Vermouri and Ariane Neumann. Thanks a lot for being here. I would really like to give the floor to Lucas now to give a good introduction on who you are and what you can mean for us in this nice discussion we will have. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mao. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for speaking who are already in for the last 15 minutes. So thanks for waiting. Yeah, I don't have anything more to say. I think Mao described really well on what we did last day and also today in the morning. So maybe I will just invite the first speaker. So Irene Luque Martin. She's a PhD in planning urban technologies. Her current expertise focuses on understanding the role of application of urban technologies like GIS, artificial intelligence, urban simulation, and visualization tools in urban planning. So she might add more and she describes more. And Irena, I give a floor for you. You have 15 minutes. And right after you, we go to another speaker and we will have Q&A at the end of all speakers. So Irena, you are welcome to start.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Really happy to do this. I'm gonna share a screen and you let me know you see it properly.
I'll let you know that we really see it good. So
you see everything, no?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm gonna try to keep it really short, although this presentation is a bit longer, but I will maybe scroll a bit faster, so we always could go back in the Q&A. I think Lucas presented already, and well, actually, it's nice that we work together, and I'm gonna show some of the projects that I did in the office. We actually were together, so it's a super nice this experience. I'm actually, because I know the topic is about virtual space and the relationship with public space, but I could not stop thinking about myself because I work a lot in technology, not only the ones that is deployed in the city, but also the technology to make cities, which is a 2 dimensions wall. And actually in my always question in the background, not that I always have when practice, is do you drive technology or does technology drive you? And I think that's almost like an open question for the workshop afterwards. But let me elaborate a bit more on that. Well, I think it's interesting to understand, and we all know that there are huge urban agendas that are applied in cities and that they compromise and they also elaborate the goals or the standards that the city have to comply to. That, of course, could be breakdown in many different goals, and that could actually be quite related to try to regulate or standardize a bit the idea of how to achieve a sustainable and a livable also public space. What I find interesting is, like, although these big agendas are quite elaborated and try to reach the complexity of cities, the reality is this video, no, it's really the city is chaos, the city is also a self-organization, the city is all about flows, all about serendipity and uncertainty. I think there is a strong focus on planners from along the whole history, really trying to understand this in a very different approach. So it's not new that most of the planners in the world are always trying to decipher this complexity. This, I call it the endless debate. Actually is always, it is data with technology, is technology with design, or is versus. And you see the more principal idea, or the most original idea of this debate is actually in the 60s, when we have Jane Jacob and all this new wave of participatory and empowerment and appropriation of public space, together with in parallel this more modernist approach, a bit more top-down, where you actually see these people who were really regulating what should be the public space and also the urban environment. I call it the pendulum because it's actually a pendulum between humanistic and technocratic. So is technology the evil, or is actually technology coming to save us? Is the city a mathematical equation, or is city just entirely a humanistic question? So this pendulum has been continuously, and it still is moving. And there are many groups of people actually trying to converge this point. And that's actually where I did a lot of research on, in the convergence between the more humanistic and the more technocratic approach. Why I'm telling this story? Because I think it's important that the debate about technology and the debate about virtual space has roots, and that we should visit those roots to actually understand the background of that discussion. Of course, I think another important input in that discussion is like today is not the same as 50 years ago. The 50 years ago, this potentially will be the capacity that our phone has right now in our pocket. And the computers were actually something not that everyone could access to. So we can actually not obtain so much data. So the reality today is that although we have grow a lot in the capacity and in the availability of the data and technology, we still are in the debate whether this is coming to help us to make safer, more sustainable, and more inclusive public space and urban environments. Here you see Adam Griffin also telling us how the technology is the enemy. And I think this was, 2 years ago, lecture in Amsterdam. So it's really impressive to see how this debate is still going on. My position in that debate is actually, through my PhD, I started a pathway of trying to understand what is my position on this, because I'm half practitioner, I'm half academia, and I am always dealing in these two worlds. And also I'm dealing in both worlds of people. I work with people that are really technocratic and really pragmatic, and then I work also with people that are much more humanistic. So I always try to see how can I facilitate this. So in my PhD, I did a bit of a proposal of a method on how do you combine more analogic process with digital processes at the same time, then you really try to bring that together in a common question, that is, how do we make this better? To make some examples, I'm going to show two examples actually. The one that is about some technology in cities that I was researching and working in MBRDB, and then also other project that I did in fabrication, that is technology to make cities. I think this is also interesting because this applies also to the digital world that you are referring to this conference a lot. Like for instance, this technology in cities is what type of technology we deploy in the city and what are the effects that we get in that. In this, we did a super interesting 2 years research in MBRDB, the Urban Studio, right now where I'm working on. And we did with Airbus. So they actually had the question of urban air mobility, what are the impacts on the city, or what are the city integration values of this. I think it's important because imagine the approach of a multinational that is Airbus, not really city friendly, really trying to impose these things and these mobility infrastructures in the public space. That was a huge impact because it's not only about the landing pad, it's about the buffer areas, it's about the wind conditions, it's about the noise pollution that it creates, but it's also about the mobility constraints that it generates because it's not complementary to the existing mobility system, and it's also quite high end because it's actually for people who are much more, let's say, wealthy. So it's also not accessible to everyone. So it could create a completely disaggregation of the actual space, and we find it now. What we try in our research was to try to deconstruct this assumption and really try to promote how we can do an urbanism that is carried and promoted by these forces that are really strong economical forces, and what are the values that this infrastructure could bring to the city, like for instance reusing all the site or all the, like, let's say, residual spaces within the highways in LA, or maybe also using nice spaces in the airport to actually interconnect and provide facilities for social meanings. So, I mean, for the conclusion of this is actually that it's really scary that there are many technologies being deployed in cities, sensors, drones, and all this, and they are composing our public space, and none of the spatial designers are actually really taking a strong and cohesive point of view on this. We are not standing in front of this and saying, what is the approach of this? And I think that's something that I personally, after this project, I'm really trying to call it a bit activism on how we are going to recover this. To be really short in the next project, and then I will be finished. Smart City Scan is a project with fabrication that is my former office, and it's the one I work with Lucas, and it was a research by design office that really look into sustainability and metabolism. I guess most of you, if they're in Delft, you have heard about it. It's not new. The office works under the radar of 6 main topics that are trying a healthy urbanism approach. I guess maybe you have here, otherwise I can go back to it afterwards. But it's about vital economy, healthy, sociocultural resilience, material, and energy. So it's trying to compose this holistic point of view of the city. And the research question actually of this project that was with the University of Amsterdam and also with the municipality of Rotterdam, the CTO Innovation Center, and with the Simulating Funds, we did this research on how can data or technology help urban designers to design more sustainable, resilient, healthy, and inclusive cities. Not a short list of goals, but well, we wanted to try this research by design. So then we combine data, design, technology, we find the right actors, and then we create a process. The process is half participatory, half research on the data part, because fundamentally a principle is we don't believe that there is a possibility to do a city design has a mathematical equation. We believe that the humanistic part needs to be there, and we need to articulate how. I'm gonna actually highlight key reflections because I have no time to go through the whole project. It's super interesting project, and I will be really happy to tell you another setup that is a bit longer. But from the 6 workshops and from the 6 analyses we did, we actually understood, and it was very interesting, and we question ourselves because we don't want to make a statement, but it's a multidisciplinary approach, a myth. Because when we were actually talking with researchers, with public space designers, with built environment designers, with experts, with policymakers, they were all in the same topics. Like, for instance, we talk about water, we talk about energy. They were all having similar data, similar conclusions, but they didn't know each other at all. So how much production of knowledge we have in parallel, and it's not actually transversally or interdisciplinary, it really connecting and really creating a network that is really strong, because at the end, we are a bit more in this individualistic approach of reaching our own bubble and not really connecting with the others for the good of the space we're going to intervene. Another key question, and they are not interrelated, although they are, but anyway, now I'm not going to talk about the interrelations between the findings, the data labyrinth. And this is an interesting one, because as doing a project within the municipality, with the University of Amsterdam, with all the experts on GIS and everything, this was the mess. To get a layer of trees in Amsterdam, you have to click approximately 20 links. So the fact of that we say there is a lot of data, but the accessibility to it, the way designers can actually use it, the way designers can implement it in their workflow, it makes a huge difference. It really completely changed also the way we approach that physical space from a digital perspective. So because we were really trying to say we need to be properly informed. We only not need to know where are the trees, but where are the performance, how much maintenance those trees demand, how much space that is there. And indeed, there is almost impossible possibilities to access this data. So I think that's also something that we need to reflect as designers, which is our data sources and how we can get to them. In that sense, for instance, what we did in this project is also elaborate. Sometimes it's even easier to create our own data, which has a two sides of a coin. Like on the one hand, it's nice because you create your own tailored situation, and then the technology is not driving you. You are driving technology because you know what data you want. But on the other hand, it's scary because it means that every designer will have to produce data by themselves, and based on the profits, etc., we don't have the capacity in practice to actually do this. So how do you deal with this dilemma? In this case, we create our own data, simplifying, like we need to know about the bridges in Amsterdam. So when water and road goes on top, it's a bridge. Something super simple, but it added a lot of value even in the municipality. Here I talk more about the performance data. I'm gonna move on to go a bit faster. Another key finding, the ethical dimension of data. This is actually really interesting to see. Like I think, and this is actually super tailored to actually the topic of your conference, because the way we use public space and the time, the situation, it also demands a lot the way of we are going to intervene, especially in terms of safety, in terms of feelings, in terms of protection, and many other things that are much more not tangible, but they are really meaningful for the livability of the public space and to make them actually inclusive. And what I actually find very interesting, like for instance, in this case, this was actually an instruction for Google Map of busyness of the spaces in Amsterdam. And of course, you see that during the day it's quite busy, but also you see spaces where at 2, 3 a.m. there are still some points pointing out. And that means that they are potentially hotspots in the night that could be interesting to have a closer look. What are they, and what are the impacts of that in the neighborhoods, and then what are the impacts of that in the spaces. What I find interesting is when we show this map in a participatory process, we got these people really mad at us. And I think it was really interesting that they were mad at us because it's TADA, and they are actually talking about ethical dimension of data and technology application in design on cities. And they were actually telling us data and documents like you show could be really highly sensitive to damage other type of people circumstances. So I think it would be nice to also know that, like for instance, there was one anecdote that there was an app that the people were actually publishing there where they meet usually, and it was like a vulnerable type of group that I'm not going to define right now here. But then other people who were stream and they were against that group decided to use scripting that data and actually extracting from the API that data, and then they actually got they attacked them in that part. So the way we use also and put forward in the digital space the conditions of the physical environment is also super important in the ethical dimension. Another one is the fieldwork of out of fashion, and we are almost there. And of course, this one is like there is a lot of data about food, activity, air pollution, noise, eat island. We spend so much time calculating these things and understanding the Grand Canyon of Schiphol, or the beautiful system on infrastructures of activities in the center, or the food accessibility in the center. The reality is that if you don't know, till you don't go to the city and you don't experience it, you don't get all these inputs. You don't get these conclusions just by the data itself. You need to know the city as well. And as a designer, as a practitioner, you really need to go down to where you are working on and have this experience, because that guides you where you want to research about and what do you want to use data for. I'm gonna skip this one. Yeah, and then we have the trap of blind spot in interpretation of data. That is very fun one. But what it refers to a lot is actually how these spaces have evolved. Like, for instance, you go from the original, and now we are trying to come back to give back again the space to the human, to the pedestrian, and to make it a much more like cities for people, no? Like Jangel mentions many times. But when we actually were trying to do that, we were saying, okay, city streets could be key streets to make pedestrian as soon as possible, so the city becomes more human-driven. So what we try to use is technology to assess what is a city street, what are the qualities, what are the indicators that define it, and how can we actually then shift them. In this case, we actually try to create a virtual space where we could actually assess what are the things that are happening in the street. So we go to Google Street View, we go all the city streets, we map them, we count them, and we count all the things that are happening. Are very weird things happening, like for instance, appears knives, it appears a baseball, it appears, I don't know, there are nice numbers, no? Like of course the bus, the bench, the clock, or the motorbike, because we realize how it's performing the city. But it also finds elephants, people, and things that are really out of the place and really completely different than what it should be. So I think somehow it's also important to mention that we really need to also understand that there are a lot of blind spots in these virtual spaces. And that's actually completely demands the completely involvement of people going to the field and understanding the spaces from a much more human perspective. So to conclude a bit, actually, what this process actually led us to is to realize that it was really productive, the usability of data and technology, to help us to create like virtual simulations of spaces and understanding problematics of the city and understanding also perspectives from the different more scientific side. But at the end, everything narrows to how you collaborate together with each other and how we were understanding things, especially together. So I think my conclusion is actually we cannot have a virtual space without a physical space, and we should actually try to converge them together.
Really nice. Thanks a lot. So Irene, thanks a lot. We will remain the questions for the end, but I really want to thank you for this like sub-conclusion, because I think we can really use it and think on it when listening to the other presentations, especially when thinking of the ethical considerations and indeed how people are working together and what is the data they want to spread from themselves, and if it has to do with whom is giving us the data. So thanks a lot for these sub-conclusions. So what I want to add is that for our attendees, if you have a question, then feel free to use the Q&A box and contribute to our discussion, because that will make the discussion afterwards way more, how to say, like way more interesting if we have your input too. So that's for the audience. Then I would like to give the floor to Lucas to give a proper and nice introduction of Fiona, because she will be our next speaker.
Thanks, Maud. And thanks, Irena, as well. Yeah, we will move to next speaker, Fiona Zish. So an architect and experimental psychologist. She works between the Institute of Behavioral Neuroscience at UCL and the Bartlett School of Architecture. She already had some speeches at international architecture and neuroscience conferences. So I invite you to start, Fiona, and take your time of around 15 minutes.
Thank you. I'll start by sharing my screen, and hopefully that works. So. Can you all see my screen here? So.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Huh. Now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Great. Okay. First, thank you very much for having me speak here. It's really nice, and hopefully I will be able to contribute something. I kind of feel maybe I'm a bit of an outlier, having just seen, is it Irena or Irene's presentation, because I'm not showing you anything about cities today. I could have, but I kind of made the choice not to because of the kind of the overarching theme of the panel having kind of different perspectives, I guess. So I thought, well, what perspective can I bring that is maybe a bit of a curveball? Maybe not. So I'll introduce myself briefly. As Lucas has already said, I'm an architect, but I'm also a cognitive scientist. And I bring both of those kind of interests and fields together in my own research and in my practice, and also my teaching. And so as you can see on my first slide, I'm kind of approaching all of this in my work, but also for today through an understanding of realities. And your kind of conference days are framed around the virtual and about kind of new types of spaces and the kind of physical and virtual and how they might intersect and work together. And so I'm going kind of one level deeper with this and wanting to really get an understanding of realities. And as you can see here, I'm interested in radical realities, but I'm saying this in terms of the kind of the root of the word, radical, meaning that it relates or affects the fundamental nature of something, and it is far-reaching and thorough. So really understanding the nature of reality is what I'm interested in and what I'd like to put into discussion for today. And so the interest that I have and what I'd like to talk about is not just the technology as such and how we might use technology and the built environment, but actually an interest in looking at ourselves in the built environment and how we experience, and then also as architects, as designers, create and understand realities and the realities that we build. And so I put this up here on the next slide. Theme for the panel, how to see from different perspectives and what practices are happening now related to the shift to the virtual. And so I'd like to ask first, is there actually a shift? And if there is this merely a technological one, or actually more importantly, is it an ontological or even an epistemological shift? And how can we not just let this happen, but then in a sense, have agency and ownership over this, and then in turn use technologies for our benefit? And this relates actually quite nicely to what Irene was talking about beforehand, is are we driven by technology or does technology drive us? And I'd actually like to propose that it's probably a reciprocal thing, and that as kind of technology and as human and other kind of biological organisms, we're creating this ecology together, and that we might actually work together here. So on this slide, what I've put here is a kind of a slight dissatisfaction with some of the technologies that we have in terms of potentials, where we seem to jump to very literal ways of using virtual reality technologies, especially in the field of design, but then also in the field of science, where we're kind of going, oh, we can use VR technologies and augmentation technologies to overlay information and data. And then on the very left, you see something that's quite sinister, where it's actually just about kind of advertising and the commercial aspect. But then even if it's just the kind of simulation of spaces that we might still be designing in terms of an immersive environment, or as designers, how we might use VR technologies to kind of envisage our designs. But I'd like to go one step further and actually think that these technologies can allow us to really reflect on ourselves and on our realities, and understand our position and our movements within a kind of a global cognitive ecology and the meaning that we have within all of this. And when I say this, it's still very much kind of using the technology, but understanding that at a larger level, we always live in a simulation. Kind of our own cognition is a simulation of sorts, which allows us then to actually take action in the world. And technology, virtual reality technology here, is something that allows us almost to start sharing and connecting this with each other, where our internal reflection and cognition is something that we can start sharing with each other, externalizing, having these conversations with each other with. So what I'm getting at basically is inviting a conversation for our panel, but then also for everyone to kind of go home and think through in how this is something that empowers us, how technology and the kind of shift to the virtual, and the shift, and I would kind of say it's a shift in inverted commas, because the virtual has always been with us. It's not something that through technology is suddenly emerging, but the virtual can be anything from reading a novel and then kind of immersing yourself in literature into your own imaginations and dreams, and then importantly sharing them. And technologies and the technologies that we have are simply allowing a different form of access, a different form of connection and sharing, and a different understanding. So I'm not really going to answer these questions, but hopefully just plant some seeds for everyone to take home with. So before we do that, I'm pretty sure that you'll have shown, or somebody will have shown this slide in one of the presentations in the course of yesterday and today. To rewind and actually think about the virtual, both in terms of a non-technological virtual and a technological virtual and real in a wider spectrum. And so you'll be familiar with this. This is the reality virtuality continuum, which shows that there's kind of many different levels within our experience of reality, from a kind of pure physical reality to a kind of virtuality, which is at the other end of this continuum. And then we've got these kind of points in between. And so in my own work, I kind of touch upon all of these different levels here, these different points across science, design, theoretical reflection, specifically also architecture and neuroscience. And I will be showing you 3 pieces of work that I have done that relate to this continuum in different ways, all interlinked, and hopefully you'll be able to incite some of your thinking that then might also be relevant for your thinking about urban or architectural environments. It's also important to say that all of the work that I do and the work that I will show you is always collaborative, so it's not just me. And this is something that's also obviously important to the work itself, but also to the very conversation that we're having, is that it's about sharing and connection. So I'll show you one science experiment that we ran, one design experiment, and then another design piece that was done by one of my students at the Bartlett. And the aim with showing all of these, and the aim of kind of using the technologies that we're discussing, the virtual reality ones, I think that the potential for all of these is not just knowing something, because it's feeling something. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this, in that we can know something, but we don't have that felt dimension. And so in a sense, it remains abstract, it remains neutral. And it's something that for design is then very difficult to access and to use in our own intuitive and kind of embodied way of doing and practicing. And I think that a lot of technologies, virtual reality technologies, are really, really useful for making things felt. So if we see kind of, for example, data visualizations, they're quite nice to look at, they're quite enjoyable, and we can kind of process them in a rational way. But there remains a level of abstraction. And Irene also touched on this, is that it's really important that you actually understand the environment within which this is taking place. And in a sense, then have this felt and embodied relationship. And this is one of the things that I'm really interested in. And you'll see how I use the tools, the virtual reality tools, to get to this. So it's not just kind of dumping a whole bunch of information on people and making them understand through this, but actually this immersive quality of really embodying knowledge within yourself, and then in your own practice, in your own design practice, in your theoretical writing, in your experimentation, that you do draw upon this on an intuitive and felt level, where you don't need to language everything or put it into data or into these forms of knowledge, but bring it out through your own embodiment. So I've put this slide up here. I'm not sure if it makes sense to everyone in this context, but this is an Ouroboros, which is a snake, or here 2 snakes eating their own tail. And so just to show that all of this going on from the continuum that I showed you beforehand is not necessarily just a continuum, but in the spirit of it becoming known and different forms of knowledge, might this actually be a loop in a sense? So all these different levels of reality and virtuality that I'm kind of throwing out there, don't they actually all feed into each other? And it's not just kind of sitting cleanly on this one continuum and you go from one step to the next, but in a sense, they all relate to each other. And through this interrelation and kind of inflection and inference that can happen, do we learn from one to the other in a way that might sometimes hide itself from us and at other times become quite obvious? So the first piece of work that I'm going to show you now, hopefully all of this makes sense. If not, please, in the conversation later on, do ask me questions, say that was all kind of bunched up. Please, can you clarify X, Y, and Z? With my science hat on, I'm going to show you an experiment that we did to understand how the different points on this loop relate to each other, the kind of pure physicality, if that can exist, the kind of virtuality, and how in terms of our cognition, our understanding of the built environment, understanding of ourselves within, how we might be able to draw connections between 2 of these. I'm also putting a bunch of quotes in between the work that I'm showing you by thinkers that I enjoy. This is Catherine Hales. If you haven't read Catherine Hales, I do encourage you to read her work. She's pretty badass. How We Became Post-Human. That's where this one's from. Virtual Bodies in Cybernetics, Literature and Informatics. And she says, virtual reality technologies are fascinating because they make visually immediate the perception that a world of information exists parallel to the real world, the former intersecting the latter at many points and in many ways. So already in here, you can kind of see it's not just cleanly separable, but all of this interlinks and interloops. And so in this experiment that we did, very straightforward science experiment, we built 3 different environments, actually 2 environments, and we tested in 3 different ways. We built a physical space. You can see this in the images on the right-hand side of the screen, and in the top axle. Built a physical space, very, very simple space, that we then also 3D scanned the space and built VR environments out of this. And then we tested people's cognition, people's memory of objects and themselves in this space. And then importantly, we started distorting the space. So you can see that in these little diagrams, how we went from a small enclosure to a large enclosure and from a square enclosure to a rectangular enclosure. And then we asked people to pick up this stool that you can see, where they kind of in a specific location in the space, they leave the space, we change the space, and then we ask them to come back and replace this stool. And so this tells us a lot about how people understand space, how they cognize space in terms of what's important. Do they see important, for example, how this object, this stool, relates to 2 of the walls, how it relates to the path that they've taken into the environment? Do they calculate an average between all 4 points of this of corners in the space, or all 4 wall points? The outcome is that it's different for everyone. So we have this kind of shared dimension of reality here, but we also make it highly individual based on our own understanding, based on if we're architects, based on if we're the scientists, or if we are bus drivers, or if we work in a coffee shop. We have different ways of understanding space. This was the kind of primary question, but far more important and relevant for this panel, I guess, is the fact that we did this across physical and virtual environments and started to understand how they differ and how they relate to each other. And the outcome is that there is a kind of an underlying baseline of a reality, but each of these gives you different things. So in terms of how you see yourself and how you understand yourself and objects in this. So we did see that in the physical environment, people were much more reliant on kind of whole of the environment because it was easier to grasp. In the virtual environment, it was much more in the kind of the immediacy of what lies right next to me, the things that I can immediately relate to. But if things were more distal and further away, they became less relevant. And this potentially has to do with where the technology is right now, and that things like kind of depth of field, depth of vision aren't quite the same yet as in a physical space. But it also might have to do with just the kind of the immersion in a virtual reality environment being quite different from the physical environment. So it's interesting to see how they interrelate, but they're not the same. I've mentioned also then how it's not just about the kind of the virtual as in what's out there, what we see through the technology or what we kind of we share with each other, but very much reflecting on ourselves in the context of this, and how in a physical environment or in a virtual environment, where you are in space, who you are, and how you see yourself in space kind of changes, because you're getting a different view on yourself and a different view on reality. So I've put another quote here by Albert Bandura, and he says, reflecting on one's own functioning entails shifting the perspective of the same agent rather than reifying different internal agents or selves regulating each other. And so in order to then understand this further, we did a design experiment this time to try and understand ourselves from a different perspective, taking literal what Bandura is here saying. So if we see ourselves from a different perspective and shifting our point of view, does that change the way that we operate and that we have agency in the environment that we're in? Rather than splitting ourselves, just shifting and kind of giving different viewpoints to ourselves while remaining in our physical body. So to do this, we built a physical setup in space, and then we have the kind of VR goggles that you get a different view on yourself on. So you're essentially in space, moving around in a physical environment, embodied rather than trying to kind of go for a disembodied thing. but you see yourself as an observer from the outside. And so you can see here, this is kind of slightly distorted to get a top-down view. We've got here Tia, who was our dancer who performed in this experiment, and you can see she's wearing VR goggles, and she's seeing what you're seeing right now. So she doesn't see her first-person point of view. She actually sees this top-down view of herself, and this is Alex, my teaching partner, who's a choreographer. They're just playing chasing games. Bear in mind, this is a highly trained and skilled dancer. She's really good at moving her body in space. And that simple shift of seeing herself from the outside while feeling herself in her own body created a completely different way of operation. And she's finding it really hard just to chase and actually kind of get a hold on Alex, just for that simple kind of shift of perspective, which also means that suddenly her sensory information doesn't align in the way that she is used to. We also got her to do a bunch of other things. For example, here she's learning a new dance move. And it's quite curious to kind of see that she might be doing this kind of rather expertly from kind of an external point of view, but she's not managing to actually match the positioning at all within which she finds herself. So you can see that her kind of internal sense of movement and her movement within a spatial environment are completely thrown off again and don't align with each other in the way that if she had her one viewpoint, she would find really, really easy. Curiously, I don't have a video of this, but we also tested this with a bunch of architects, and we did way better on it, which already says a lot about different people and your background doing doing some strange things to you, because all of us are really used to looking at environments in top down and in this kind of bird eye view, because this is how we design. So curiously, also navigating this labyrinth that we have here on the floor, we did really well. We kind of, you had to get a handle on when I turn left, this happens, when I turn right on, this happens, but we're fairly accurate because we're used to navigating these worlds in a way that a dancer always so much in their body might not be. So again, it says something about the kind of the difference within a shared reality, and we're all getting the same experience, but the technology allows us here to really see how that same experience might differ and aberrate, and how there are kind of then strange connections. And here, this is third quote by Richard Schusterman. Again, if you've not heard of him, look him up. He writes quite nicely about a concept called soma aesthetics, which is the aesthetics of movement, not in what movement looks like from the outside, but in what it feels like from the inside. And if you take a moment to reflect on this, you might agree with me that there are some movements that feel really pleasant and kind of aesthetic to you, and we enjoy them. And then there's other movements, and I'm not even going as far as to saying painful movements, but movements that we just don't draw that same aesthetic experience from. And so coming out of, and I'm kind of talking as if these things all happened one after each other, but all the different work that I'm showing you is kind of dispersed and interlinked in the way that we conceive of it and do it. But I'll read you Schusterman's quote quickly. Bodily action or movement is said to be improved by looking inward to establish a stable sense of self from which action can more effectively emerge. Now that's also quite interesting in the sense of what we've just seen with Tia moving and kind of moving well and maybe moving not so well, where she's having to suddenly really flip and investigate her internal sense of movement versus what she's seeing versus what she's used to see. And so her sense of self is being played with here, and the reflection on herself. And the third piece of work that I'll show you does exactly the opposite in terms of what we were doing in that design experiment. This is actually more experiential design that is done by one of my students. So in this, kind of the external view becomes meaningless. So this piece was called Unbalance. And what we did was we built a platform that can shift and move in relation to your movement. So as you're moving along on this platform, and I'll show you the video in a moment. As you're kind of standing and moving on this platform, the platform moves and shifts, which again prompts your movements to change because you're on this unstable ground. This is also then linked to this wearable device, that the person performing here is wearing. This wearable device is a bunch of tubes that have beads in them, and these beads kind of shift and trickle along the body and distribute weight and sensation differently across the body as you're moving, again, to give you a different sense of your movement and different sensations. The final layer is then a VR environment that is linked to the movement of the platform and the movement of the controllers that you can see here, and creates this, this visual environment for you to kind of see, which is, again, these kind of bead-like structures that shift and move as you're moving. So you're never getting a sense, a kind of a visual cue of yourself or of the external environment, but you're literally kind of seeing the movement, and in relation to that, you're also feeling the movement of the beads on your skin. So what all of this does is it creates a kind of a highly immersive and internal view of movement and of self, where the external environment really kind of fades into the background of your cognition. I'm not sure you can hear the sound on this video. It's just, it's basically the beads as they kind of trickle and swoosh over the body. There is no other sound to this. So I'll maybe let you see this as a final piece. She never sees herself like this, obviously, because she's only getting an kind of the view out from these beads. It was quite interesting also when we were doing this and we were exhibiting it in public venues, how people who weren't used to moving and who were a bit timid with VR environments or with kind of performing in a public sphere or kind of moving in front of others, through all of this, through being in this environment and getting this feedback and really the kind of the outside world blending away, that suddenly the types of movements that we saw people perform completely shifted, and there was a kind of a freeing and a kind of letting go and having a completely different perception of self in the world, where the self-awareness of I'm being watched seemed to become meaningless because people were just going for the pure aesthetics of the movement and what this might feel like. So yes, so this is the final piece. I'm aware of time also.
Yeah, I think I can make a nice conclusion of it too, Fiona.
Yeah, so this is just because I said everything that I do is collaborative. So these are the people that I collaborate with in terms of my science lab and in terms of kind of the design work that I do. And if you are interested in more, I kind of have to do a little promo thing. This is where we work with students and where we teach. But yeah, I hope that it's gone in a different direction, I think, but it's just, I'd like to kind of just put that into the conversation about how we might use these tools as a reflective mechanism to understand ourselves in this wider field, and then actually think about the ethics that were also raised in the last thing, and the morals and what responsibilities we have as designers, and knowing that we're integral parts of these systems, not just external viewpoints. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, I would say thank you too. Yeah, and I think your perspective was really interesting for us. The image of the mixed reality wasn't brought up earlier, so thanks for sharing. Yeah, it was new information.
Okay.
So thanks a lot. So that's why it's also extra interesting to have your perspective in this discussion later on, because I think from the Technical University of Delft, where the organization of this event is taught, urbanism and landscape architecture, we look more from the point of spatial visualization and then see what's possible in that way, but not working with AR a lot yet. So I think it's really nice to know also about that. And then secondly, I thought the finding about acting differently, physical and virtually, also in spatial sense, is different. So I once saw this thing of people entering a mall, and then physically some people would earlier go right and some would go left, but now we know virtually we could make a complete difference, could head a complete different direction. Yeah.
It's to say that the kind of it's always about the dynamics and about the kind of the relationship with you and the external world, but then also importantly about the experiences that you've had and about how you've trained yourself, because this is something that each one of us will have very different ways of doing and thinking about space. It's not something that is static, it's something that is learned. And so it's also something where using kind of technology in a way to gain access to different ways of understanding is quite useful, because we're not designing just for ourselves, but designing for lots of other people. And so you might be able to shift your viewpoint through the use of technologies to at least get a glimpse into what other realities might be.
I agree. Yeah, and also then the third point, which I could relate to last presentations, the ones of yesterday and today, going back and forth between physical and virtual space. It's also that it's coming from a different personal perspective, so it's related to the point we just brought up, and then it's in a literal sense and a figurative sense. It was really nice, I think, when showing the chasing game. So people are responding differently with different backgrounds. So to say that when you have a good sense of so when you have a good sense of
it's your spatial ability and how you kind of navigate. I could have put it in there, and it's when we were doing this, most people struggled with kind of just navigating it, and then this guy who was a hand artist came along, and I'm like, what's a hand artist? Hand acrobat. And then it's like, oh, I do handstands for a living. I'm like, really? And then he goes, can I navigate it the way I want to? And we're like, sure. And he goes up on his hands and he walks the whole thing perfectly on his hands. Wow. So his whole thing was also flipped, all the while he's seeing himself from the outside. And everyone struggled doing it.
It could have even an extra layer. So thanks a lot for sharing all this information. It was really interesting. So then I would like to give the floor to Lucas again to share with us the story about Vamsi. So thanks again, Fiona. And
thanks, Maud, and thanks, Fiona. We have next speaker, Vamsi Krishna Vemuri. So he's a speculative architect, entrepreneur, and as well as educator. He's based now in Germany. So he operates an intersection of speculative design, immersive media, and real-time visualization. He's also a founder of Flux Real Design Collective, an interdisciplinary practice engaging in the domains of architecture, gaming, cinematics, and advanced fabrications. Vamsi, if you are ready and you can enter, you can start talking. Yeah.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Lucas, and thanks for having me here, Maud. So I just wanted to add one little detail. So I'm currently co-founding an organization called Futurely. It's an educational platform, and so that's a bit of my bio that had to be changed. Nevertheless, I will start sharing my screen. I hope my screen is visible and it's just blank at the moment. Yeah, awesome. Great, guys. Hello, everyone. And I'm really glad to be here on this panel with these amazing set of speakers. So my presentation for today is called Spatial Interfaces, Gamescapes, and Spam. Unlike the other speakers, I don't hail from an urban background or a planning background either. I'm a speculative designer who works into looks into a more interdisciplinary approach. When I say interdisciplinary, it's for real, because I take a lot of analysis and study from video games, spatial interfaces, UX and UI design, and work with the media of virtual reality and augmented reality. And also, I try to express my work through film and visualizations. So with that being said, it puts me in a frame of asking questions about the near future and the kind of intriguing emerging spaces that emerge, that come out of this blur between the virtual and the physical space. That's something that really interests me a lot. And so let's get right into it. I must say that from Fiona's presentation in the last, she also added a nice framework on top of which I can explain whatever I'm going to be doing better. So we're all familiar with and are used to consume and interact with information in 2D, which is more understandable in terms of the dimensionality and the resolution. The software, the 2D planes, the mobile screens, and media interfaces, both at an individual and an urban scale, is saturated with 2D screens and interfaces. So on the other hand, with an increased dimensionality and with the computational power that's possible right now, we can engage and interact more with spatialized interfaces. So with the advent of virtual, augmented, and mixed reality, it's certainly an emerging and inevitable transition. Like Fiona had, I also have a slide that I usually carry, and I think most of you are by now somehow familiar with the three paradigms primarily, VR, AR, and MR. So we'll just get to the next steps. So when talking about spatial interfaces, what comes into perspective is when we start to interact inside and outside the boundaries of screens. The screen as a physical limitation, you tend to go beyond that, and then you tend to spatialize, or you tend to use your context or your city as an interface. That's when spatial interaction or spatial interfaces start becoming relevant. And this begins to disrupt the modes of perceiving urban spaces, streets, landscapes, and buildings. So in the present day, we use our mobile phones and tablets as an additional aid to finding places of interest. You would take out your phone and check Google Maps when you don't know a spot. Otherwise, you just put it down, put it back in, and you keep walking. But at the same time, with the advent of augmented reality-based tech and augmented reality-based dashboards for vehicles, or through Google Lens or similar wearable devices, what happens is that it becomes more of an inherent phenomena that is always there. So when this becomes like a layer of superimposition that is inevitable, which it will be in the near future, what is the role of traditional signages and place markers? How do we perceive these visual cues and information in a city while it's going to be superimposed with all these interfaces? Would you still be looking for physical signages, or would you be willing to engage with only the lens that you're using or the piece of tech that you're wearing? So how much of it will stay and how much of it will lose? Again, I'm not here to give you answers, but rather spark some interesting questions that you might want to consider for later. And when we talk about spatial interfaces, we can take a look at it from a more interdisciplinary lens, because video games have been doing this really extensively for a long time now. What's fascinating about it is because of the fictional construct of it, there is a whole lot of opportunity to work with multiple forms of representation, multiple forms of mapping, annotations. And in the recent years, through the evolution, we can even see that the mode of user experience and the mode of representation of a map is more spatialized around the user. And that lets you identify your next destination and next point of interest. So the navigation becomes far more seamless. although the real world deployment and the real world understanding of the kind of experiences is still yet to be tested, but this gives a new layer or new canvas to experiment with. So this extends also towards utilization of surrounding environment to highlight information, tasks, or messages. So how do you think the signages would transform the usual urban cues and elements that are used in the street context? How do they get more amplified, or do they get augmented this way? These are some things that can be really interesting to touch upon and work on, because no matter how much we look at these things, can we also, like, when we look at the current context, it's driven by the platform-based economy dictated by the language of Google and the big players in the market. And it's not necessarily driven by the state or by planners or urban designers. And so there is never a cohesive or coherent language of how these things are put out in space, because it's as simple as when you switch an app, you have a completely different UI, you have a completely different interface, and you deal with a different language altogether. So, but how do you make that coherent and how do you make that consistent? Because that's how our current signages or current urban cues have been designed to. So in continuity to the adoption of VR, AR, based interactions in the city, VR also has been transforming, and it's been a forerunner in making spatial and immersive interactions more accessible. In fact, at this point, technologically speaking, VR is far more convenient, and it is more ready as a piece of tech to engage with and interact. That's really well evident from the previous presentation as well. So it doesn't also mean that it's confined to entertainment only. That's another notion that comes up when we talk about VR. But we also can see a swift adoption in work, communication, and social interactions. So for instance, during the course of the pandemic, my own personal work culture has transformed more to deal with VR and working with the digital medium a lot more rather than before. So in addition to this, I'd like to bring about two experiments. These were not conducted by me, of course, but it's done by some students from researchers from Japan. And these are really fascinating. They were conducted 2 to 3 years ago. So these technologies not only add a new form of perception and interaction, but they also alter the behavior of users in virtual spaces. Again, building on the previous presentation, what we see here is an interesting study by a team of researchers from Japan. They study and evaluate the anthropometric ergonomics for embodied interaction. What that means is when you wear these goggles, you basically embody a virtual avatar. And what they've done is they've tried to work with different forms and different scales of the same avatar. So they created multiple bodies, and they performed virtual activities such as opening and closing doors, opening a locker, or using a wheelchair. And they were able to map out the kind of time it takes and the kind of accessibility and the convenience in both the virtual and the real space. So these kind of studies definitely give a more understanding of how close we are or how farther we are to the real scale consumer level implementation. And secondly, this is another experiment where how do you deal with this when you have multiple users having these VR headsets and they are interacting and engaging in the same space? So what kind of dynamics happen in such a scenario? And they talk about something called the tile maneuvers. So well, they have a virtual maneuvers. So basically you have a given grid of space or a tile of space that you engage with, and you only are limited to move within the tile because of your virtual boundaries. And in the second experiment, they switch the maneuvers and they let you move from one tile to another tile. So experiments like these give you more behavioral attributes of what they enjoyed more and what they feel is more confined or more constrained as a place of movement and engagement. So what are the new user behaviors going to be like? How would it affect the planning of urban or public spaces? These are some interesting questions that spark, because there is an emergence of alteration of behavior when you engage with these kind of technologies. So now I've been focusing more on a human individual perceptive scale, looking at the behavior of how people reciprocate with these technologies. Now let us take a look at a more expanded arena of gamescapes. We are aware of the concept of gamification and the ideas and principles that have been there since long. In the recent years, it has expanded into a more urban scale through various means, predominantly through location-based augmented reality, through games such as Pokemon Go. What you see here is a Pokemon Go map, which is overlaid on top of Google Map of Boston. Although we will try to take a look at closer at its predecessor, it's called Ingress. It's another video game, a location-based game scattered across the city, and it lets you interact with portals. The game also creates an overlaid point of interest through statues, sculptures, and monuments in public spaces, and it begins to add a new altered semiotic value to the existing fabric of the city, which is really fascinating because you start reading your city and your context and your familiar monuments and sculptures in a more different reading. And you start understanding a new alternate history about the space. And the users interact and engage with an alternate map of their city, which is not simply an overlay, but rather intersects through various streets and arteries, creating its own navigation paths and social systems with tasks and elements of interest. Users plan, map out, and wander around the city, identifying these pockets and connect portals to conquer territories. So users, basically, they are equipped to the level of sophistication where they can annotate using custom drawing tools and distribute it with their friends and communities. And this leads to newer social circles and newer urban space utilization, which get devised as a part of the process. The framework, however, is not only limited to entertainment, but can also be expanded into an essential attribute such as education. This is where I have a snippet of my experimental project, which deals with establishing a framework of geolocation-based education system where users need to commute between various locations to unlock and consume their academic information. What happens when these kind of activities are not specific tasks of leisure, but are integrated with your regular routine? So here I talk about an app called Focus that I envisioned based on an AR augmented reality based decentralized education system in a near future. It's based on the evolution of Cedric Price Pottery Think Bell project and Berlin Free University project. And these are some of the elements that set the stage for the augmented city of the future. I'm not going to get into detail due to the interest of time. We're talking about a city level connectivity and availability of AR infrastructure and university education in a gamified manner. So this is a short snippet of the experimental video showcasing how such framework would operate and function in the city. This was done 4 years ago. And so these new breeding activities will become more relevant while developing the evolving urban infrastructures. So it's a sort of a disruptive moment that does not occur only for pedestrians or individual persons, but it also changes the way you commute and transport from place to place. Right. I get to the last part of my presentation with that. The current urban facades and infrastructure is an already excessive space. Billboards, banners, signages, and architectural elements are all super saturated in many urban cities. So how do these augmentations add to the existing high resolution city? So all this while we are adding another superimposed layer upon layer, and this is also another visual layer. So these are some of the potential challenges while dealing with geolocation-based augmented reality. Excessive content in the form of spam, distraction, ads, pop-ups, and community-based additions and various layers can come into play. And how do we regulate them? And this existing fabric can also be transformed into a piece of art in certain cases using certain available tools, enabling a personalization of public space. So I'd like to conclude with this slide where we embrace these evolving urban conditions, firstly because of the pandemic, and secondly because of the accelerating technological advancements, blurring the lines between the physical and real spaces. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Famzi. It was really interesting to see how gamification had a relation with the physical world and how we could use it. So thanks a lot for relating to that. And also the short movie you showed was related to the workshop we have, which is interwoven with this Bachakusha presentation, because we had one part of the workshop before and we will have one part afterwards. So thanks a lot for showing us also this side. Because of time, I would say we have to go quickly to Ariel. So sure. I would give Lucas the floor to give a good introduction on Ariel.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you, Vamsi. I also want to ask all attendees if you really have questions to make our, let's say, a discussion more effective after the speeches. Ask questions now. We will read them later, and or tell your opinion on certain aspects. Yeah, maybe Ariel will add something, but shortly. He's an urban scientist working to few cities and technology. He coordinated and deployed a worldwide network of city science living labs in a variety of cities. Yeah, he currently do his PhD. As I understand, maybe you will tell Ariel more about this if you want. And I just give you a floor, and please, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. Let me just start by sharing my screen and tell me if you can see that.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, very good. So thank you, Lucas and Maud, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at this quite early hour at the East Coast. But nevertheless, I'm happy to share the work we're doing in my group, at the City Science Group of the MIT Media Lab, as you mentioned, where I pursue my PhD at the moment. We are in troublesome times. We are facing quite a lot of challenges nowadays in our cities, in our built environment, from congestion and pollution to the current pandemic, to immigration and migration, and of course to the climate change that is not going anywhere. And as we all know, these challenges have kind of a bipolar relationship to our built environment. The city affects the challenges affect the city, and this is kind of a circular behavior that we're facing according to these challenges. Our biggest problem is that the planning and kind of designing mechanisms that we have in hand today just don't fit those challenges. They're slow and bureaucratic. They're in most cases top-down and do not take in consideration the needs of the public. And if they take the need of the public, usually it's in the form of tokenism, right? It's just about informing kind of our public what is about to come, but never really understanding deeply and kind of immersively what are the needs of our citizens. And that, I think, eventually resorts us to look into this design echo chambers in which the design world is closing itself into what it knows and what it cares about, but much less about how it can actually affect those major challenges that we're all facing just these days. In the past few years, my team and I at the MIT Media Lab work on a project we call Cityscope, in which we're trying to bring together technology, the built environment, and human behavior to better understand the impacts, those circular impacts between our environment and our lives. The Cityscope is set to propose a new urban process in a way that we're utilizing technology, but not as kind of a top-down, technocratic, smart cities approach, but rather as a bottom-up, collaborative decision-making process. We're looking at Cityscope into 4 major categories or 4 major themes. We're looking into urban insights, predictions, transformation, and eventually building consensus. These are big words for this early hour in the morning, but I'll try to break them down through some examples and some projects. So when we talk about insights, we're basically talking about looking backwards into the city. How do we observe all the different information layers that are existing there? We basically break down, decompose the city into its layer from, how energy moves in the city, how wind might affect, solar, land use, all the well-known and kind of pretty common understanding of the city. But in the past few years, my team and I started to kind of lean towards looking into urban dynamics insight. So how do we understand the city from the point of view of the user, of the movement, and giving the many interesting and readily available sensor data, mostly telecom data, we started having a microscopic, high-resolution understanding of these behaviors, but then sometimes in a city or even in a country scale. So where do people go? Where do they gather? How much time they spend in each place they are? What are the hotspots and POIs that are interesting in the built environment? And very recently, of course, in the context of the virus, how would, for example, an entire country react to different orders and different regulations concerning a stay-at-home order during COVID-19? Again, learning and kind of understanding how people behave in the city. But looking backwards, it's only one part of that equation. Actually, when we think about a new urban process, we need to think about how we look forward. Basically, how we take the current situation and examine different what-if scenarios. So a project we did a couple of years ago was actually looking again into telecom data, but in this case was actually trying to understand what are the relationships between human behavior in the city and other systems and functions that we're familiar with. So we basically did a data meshing of many, many different data layers, from telecom data to the physical layers, the amenities, the street networks, and eventually using some modeling, machine learning, we could basically correlate where people stay in the city, where they congregate together, where they come together, and the different urban functions. So we can eventually have a predictive model that might tell us what are the areas that are more prone to create those congregations, given certain amenities. So if I have a bar, a restaurant, and a church, what is the potential for that place to actually gather the same amount of people and bring them together into that location? This is, of course, very valuable for decision makers, because then they can start and understand their city in a much finer grain resolution and improve their decision making. A different type of prediction is how we move in the city. And this is a project in which we were trying to correlate massive amount of movement in the vicinity of the city of Boston, about 1.6 million people that are commuting in and out every day, and show how minor changes, really microscopic changes to the built environment in one small area, as you can see on the bottom right side, might affect that commuting patterns over time. Again, a predictive model, this time in a more interactive manner. And the problem is that sometimes when we want to do these predictions, we don't have the data necessary to kind of build models that concatenate what we already know. So a different approach, which is usually in our group led by research of agent-based modeling, is looking in this case into a large transportation hub in the city of Hamburg, in which we're trying to show what would be kind of the what-if scenarios for minor changes, minor interventions into that metro hub, and how tens of thousands of tourists might affect, might change their commute given those changes. and very recently a project we just completed in the Champs-Élysées Boulevard in Paris, in which working with the city of Paris and PCA architects, again, utilizing agent-based modeling in order to understand better what will be the impacts for changes in that famous boulevard. It's kind of funny to talk about this project in the context of today, because the boulevard used to be extremely congested, polluted, noisy, etc. It's much different, I guess, in the past few months, but in general, we want to improve and bring back that boulevard. So as you can see, we have constructed that model. This was in an exhibition in Paris up until very recently. And you can also explore that exhibition virtually if you go to this link down here. Now, as you probably imagine by now, most of these predictions are kind of focusing on how we move and how we behave in the city. But one of the, I think, major interests we might have as designers is how the city might look like, not just how it operates. And this is becoming crucial when we think about early stages of design in which we're creating these very rudimentary, very basic zoning maps, but we know that they have tremendous effect on how the city might look like. We just don't know how. Some might say, you know, if you're coming from an architecture background, why don't you just render it and visualize it? But we all know that these renderings are, in many cases, no more than marketing stunts. And in other cases, they don't really give a good representation of how the city might look like. And so in this project, Deep Scope project, we took a page from Kevin Lynch's famous work, The View from the Road, in which we were trying not to think about how exactly the city might look like, but more so how it might feel. To do that, we resorted to new technology, just emerging technology known as GAN. Some of you might know that. It's generative adversarial network. And in a combination between a tangible user interface, we can see on the left, the GAN model in the middle, we could then have a real-time representation of how the city might look like concerning any kind of design iteration. So you are seeing here that quickly the design session, the users are interacting with the land users and are recreating the urban plan, and in real time this affects the visualization of the city. Now, by now you probably have seen a lot of that interactive platform that we are building into Cityscope, and this leads me directly into the third theme, which is transformation. Because insights and predictions can only take us to the point where we might imagine what the city might look like. But now we can actually talk about what we should do in order to transform it to that scenario. And this is really where Cityscope shines. One second. Can you still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
You see the chat in the middle, or is it just me?
We see your screen, and we can see the chats. I think now we can see a different screen, but it was just the same presentation as before.
Okay. Is that okay? Great. So just to go back, this is really, I think, where Cityscope shines, because so much of the work we're doing is based on building an iterative, interactive, and collaborative urban decision-making platforms. And so in this project from a few years ago in the Volpe site, actually very close to our lab at MIT, we have brought together all of these ideas of how we create a real-time interactive decision-making process through those tangible user interfaces. So what you're seeing on the bottom right side is those researchers discussing the plan for the site, talking about it, but then can actually in real time physically change it using those Lego bricks and get updates on different KPIs as they move along. So you can, I think, imagine the rapidness and agility of making decisions in a built environment very, very quickly. And more recently, we've transitioned a big part of this work, most of this work, into an online version, so you can actually do that not just in front of physical spaces, but also in the virtual spaces. We weren't planning on doing that for the pandemic, but of course the pandemic proved to be a good moment to test these systems abroad in a much wider crowd across countries and across locations without the necessity for a physical spatial platform, although we still very much like to do those physical platforms. Now, when we talk about collaborative, I mentioned iterative and collaborative. When we talk about collaborative, up until this moment, for insights, predictions, and transformation, we haven't discussed whatsoever the need to bring the public into the conversation. All of these conversations, insights, and predictions, and transformation could happen behind closed doors in some planning authority or real estate developer. How do we actually bring the public into the conversation through the usage of these social technical tools? So I'm going to give you two examples and kind of finish with that. This project from a few years ago was commissioned by the City of Boston and the Barr Foundation in order to help the city better understand the impacts of transitioning to bus rapid transit system. For those of you who are not familiar, these are basically buses running on dedicated lane with prepayment systems and improved stations, cutting the cost of light rail and of course underground rail in tens of percentages, and therefore very, very effective for improving transportation in cities. In the context of the City of Boston, 5 new lanes were introduced, most of them meeting in this point, as you can see on the bottom right side, Dudley Square. And from our team at MIT, we were not asked to help with the planning. The planning was very much there. We were asked to create a co-creation and a buy-in process with the local community. So we came up with 3 different Cityscope platforms in 3 different scales: street, the community, and the regional scales, and a whole slew, a whole bucket of different technologies that we introduced for that purpose. As you can see, around those tables are not MIT researchers, but actually the community leaders themselves. So we trained the community leaders to run those models, to run those platforms, and create the engagement by themselves. And then we invited the public for a few weeks of open discussions and interaction to actually explore and understand what might be the impact of those changes, but also co-create. That is, crowdsource their understanding of their environment in order to improve the plan imposed by the government. And the last project I want to show you in this context, which is, I think, taking this idea of collaborative decision-making to the extreme, was a project we did in the city of Hamburg. So our collaboration in Hamburg started in 2015 with an idea of helping them designing for the Olympic Games of 2024, which changed dramatically as soon as the city realized that by the end of 2016, about 80,000 refugees are about to arrive from Middle East and South Africa and North Africa. These are about 500 people arriving to the city every day, living in these poor conditions, which are better than what they had on the way from the Middle East, but nothing that they can sustain for over a few days or weeks. So in November 2015, the mayor of Hamburg get a referendum and an understanding that the Olympic bid is a first world problem he's not going to confront at this moment. Actually, what he needs to deal with is the refugee issue. And he comes to us and tells us that we have a few months and very small budget to come up with a solution. At the time, we just established our collaboration with the city of Hamburg, but we literally copy-pasted everything we know about Cityscope collaboration, community engagement, all of the knowledge we've gained from previous projects and brought it to the city, so much so that with German accuracy, 3 months later, we've initiated the Finding Places project. You can see the mayor of Hamburg here holding the first Lego brick and initiating what would become a community engagement and public participation long-term effort to not only understand what is the current situation of the refugees in the city, but actually find places and find location using those social technical platforms to kind of resort locations for their housing in the future. So a session would start by basically understanding what is the current position, what is the current situation of refugees in each neighborhood, and then users would transfer into that interactable Cityscope platform in which they would literally play with Legos, but each Lego brick has, you know, much more meaning in this case. It's about where refugees should live, how many housing units we can accommodate in this location. And each community, each part of the community could then make a decision, you know, this parking lot is deserted, we can use it. This underutilized building is empty, why don't we just host refugees over there? And then the system reactively let them know what is the zoning situation, the land pollution, any kind of other information there that might help them steer their plan and their ideas. This went for about 3 months, and the results, I think, kind of stunned everybody. There was a lot of assumption that this project will become kind of a NIMBY project, not in my backyard, meaning fine refugees, but not in our neighborhood. In effect, about 160 places were found by the community, by the city. And as you can see in the map on the upper right side, they're beautifully distributed all across the city, meaning it's not just some neighborhoods that were willing to accept them. But as soon as the project, as soon as the process was introduced in a different way, there was much more acceptance and much more willingness to accept the refugees. Not only that, but since we have removed that bottleneck of community engagement and public acceptance, some sites were starting to construct while we were doing the project. So people were still playing with Legos, but some sites were already being constructed. That's because we removed that bottleneck. This project is currently being cited worldwide as a success story for community engagement and public participation in very, very tense moments. And those organizations you're seeing here are now creating it as part of a toolkit that will be used for other purposes around the world. So this was kind of a snippet of some of the work we're doing. We have collaborations all over the world. You can see that map is constantly changing, and we just came back from a virtual summit in Guadalajara in which we created a new city science lab. But for me, the purpose is very much not to inject our ideas and our notions about how cities should be, but more so outsource our tools and our knowledge so that the locations, each one of those locations could basically make a good use of those platforms and technologies for their own benefit. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
So thanks a lot, Ariel. Yeah, I would say for other speakers to also show their faces again so we can get into this intense discussion. I really also want to say about your work, Ariel, that I think it's really interesting to see this interweaving and also the conditions given for decision making and how you have to deal with the social interactions, how you can optimize them. So I think that's a really interesting thing to include. So to relate it back to the question we had for today for the event, we got a lot of tools reached and information. And I'm really curious, how can we use these tools and information given our spatial professions as urbanists and landscape architects to position ourselves as designers and planners? I would like to firstly pose the question to, let's say, Ariel, you ended. So first pose it to them and then probably the others can respond to that.
Sure. So once again, thank you very much for having me. You know, I think you're spot on. There is a lot of tools, I would say even too many tools. We actually see more and more technology around us. And to that sense, I think that where I would aspire us to go is not so much to get surrounded by tools that are imposing their understanding on our built environment, as much as I want these tools to be harnessed by a new process. As I mentioned, this new urban process in which it's the public, it's the person in the center, but then the tools are just augmentation of the needs and aspirations of the public. If we're successful in doing that, then the tools are no more than a pencil or a piece of paper. They're just there in order to convey our ideas and our notions and our understanding. But I think we're in this challenging moment where the tools are becoming so sophisticated that there is the tendency to surrender to the tool. Probably all of us heard about generative design and kind of AI and machine learning and all of that. And we're using all of these tools. We're pretty good at using them, but we also, I think, understand the limitation. And when we don't understand those limitations, we're starting to be, in a place where we let the pencil draw itself, we let the ruler rule, and I think we should avoid that. So to me, it's all about how we always think and make sure that the person is in the middle of the conversation, and that the new urban process is centered around people, not around machines, technology, and data.
Could I add or reply on this? Because I actually find very interesting that, well, thank you all for the lectures. It was super nice to see also the multidisciplinarity and the variety of point of view. I'm gonna become a bit a different profile on here, and then I'm gonna become a bit the practitioner, really pragmatic. But I work in an office like MBRDB, and it's extremely high intensity design office where we do a lot of master planning, city making, like almost industrial production. And I find interesting because we have a huge discussion about this topic, about the technology and what is technologies could help us make us more efficient, or help us to optimize, or help us also to make better solutions. My personal perspective on this is like, I think there is a key limitation, and I agreed on that with Ariel. Like one of the key limitations is the universalization. There are no tools that are able to work everywhere, because every planning culture, every design culture, every political culture works very differently. So the tools that aims to support either collaborative process or the tools that aim to actually support design process are not tailored per context. You have tools that are able to be tailored or to be facilitated or to be actually engaged with people. So there is a facilitator, a human head, like Ariel said, that somehow guides that process and then facilitates between the tool and the person. My question actually would be, to respond to your question, is myself, knowing my clients, knowing the directors I have, star architects and star designers, knowing also the stakeholders we manage with, like developers, strong lobbies, economical lobbies, and where for us, even having a participatory process is something that we have to fight for, literally fight for, to include. And the technology comes to tell truth that they don't want to hear. Most of these actors. I am personally struggling a lot with all my expertise, all my PhD, all my research about artificial intelligence, ABM, participatory process, etc., to be able to integrate this in practice, to make it work in practice. While in research, I think it's quite advanced, in practice is really behind, at least in the private market. So my question is, in this forum now, people who are really understanding how to operate with that, how can we bring it down? How can we bring it to areas that where I, as a designer, have the capacity to integrate technology in my questions, and to integrate technology also in my processes? Because besides supporting me to draw, many offices don't find the profit on it, so they don't want to include it.
Can I just extend from that? And I can see a relevance. I hope my relevance makes sense to you, but I think that I agree with you. Do I say Irene or Irene? Irene. Okay. In that it is that, but I think also the question here is, with the kind of technology becoming so sophisticated, it's a question of access, and it's a question of being able to use something. And because I always, I agree with kind of putting people at the center, although I would like to see this in a bit of a more non-anthropocentric framework and actually thinking on a kind of wider planetary scale. Even if it is just purely for the benefit of humans, at the end of the day, we still need to account for a wider ecological system because we're in a big mess right now. And I think that we do have that responsibility and that duty as designers, both in research and in practice. But I think that the question is not so much just kind of using the technologies, but also making them accessible and employable across different ways of thinking and different ways of collaboration, because there's a kind of, well, it's the learning curve on the one hand, that the technologies are not only sophisticated in themselves, but then we also need to be able to use them. But it's also something that even though you could say it's kind of very democratic, as soon as you have an internet connection, there's a lot that you can do, but we still are not at a point where it's kind of hardware agnostic and we can just kind of do whatever we want. So it does exclude to a higher level rather than include. And so I've not got a kind of specific conclusion to draw from this, but it's something that I would like to add to that, because I mean, I don't have years of practice experience the way that I would imagine you do. I've kind of hidden in academia for most of my adult life. I didn't really get on well with as I tipped my toe into the practice-based pond. But I do see this as one of the crucial things, in that a lot of things remain as a kind of theoretically good idea, and in research and in these circles, we can get things done. But as soon as you go out into the world and you have to deal with the complexities of stakeholders, of clients, of policymakers, of planners, of regulations, etc., then a lot of the ideas that you have just can't be realized in the same way, not in the actual outcome, but in the very processes that you'd actually like to take. And I think that one of the responsibilities is for us to think how we can use technology in a way that doesn't exclude, but is actually more inclusive. If that makes sense.
But if I can just very quickly, not to hijack the conversation, but just to reply a bit to what Irene, I think it is, said. I think you're totally right. Look, it's impossible to imagine we ask the architects to be in charge of that because it's not financially viable. It's impossible to imagine the engineers coming in with an idea of let's do a community engagement when it's not wanted. But the funny thing is that your office and us, we met very recently in a project in Germany in which the government was the motivator for the incorporation of these tools. And then that, of course, I think created a beautiful path for your firm to create a wonderful tool that was a community engagement and participation focused tool. So in our view and in all of our labs and all of our experience around the world, it's always about the government. It's always about the decision makers to incorporate that part into the process. It's never about just the designers. We've never seen a process that could totally bottom up emerge, but we are looking into what we call top up process. It's top down and bottom up all together, motivated by the government, but then materialized through the design and through the research.
I think I'd like to build upon what Fiona and Ariel said in the end. I have a slightly different background in terms of how I would position myself with the interest in interdisciplinarity and also being an auxiliary education platform. So firstly, the interest for tools or learning tools, I think definitely is essential in terms of at least to the extent of understanding the trajectories that things are navigating or moving towards. And also looking at more of this lens of virtual and augmented reality, because that's something that I'm more familiar with. There is this new space or new opportunity space that I feel that we as designers can harness, which is not so politically governed and politically constrained at the moment, because that's how this whole tech industry or the startup culture and everything has evolved in the past, in the recent past. Because they are not really bound by these kind of regulations that we go through for the infrastructure and the planning of cities. And in this kind of a space, where I just would like to trace back 4 years ago, where when I first, as an architect, engaged with the medium of VR and AR, and then I met some of the computer scientists and game designers who were far more sophisticated even back then at that point in understanding the potentials and pushing the limitations of how you can engage with these tools. And I believe that sort of a cross-disciplinary collaboration and also understanding of their subject and we trading our subject and the crossover between the disciplines here works really well in developing more digital or this sort of hybrid frameworks. I don't know if that totally makes sense, but yeah.
Yes, it does. It really does indeed. And I really like to also have your point of view from the outside. I also think it's really good you mentioned how the sorry, I don't remember the term. How the technical industry started up. I'm sorry. Yeah, I wanted to use the right term. And I saw that Irene wanted to say something after Ariel and Fiona complemented each other's story. So please do. Then probably Vamsi, when you want to reply again, that's great.
Okay.
Your debate. No, but I was just like, I find interesting that sometimes also in these conversations, so when I am in these debates, I hear all of us, including myself, and then we are talking of technology and data in a very broad sense, when it's actually something we should really a bit break down to see the nuances, no, and the differences. Like, for instance, I think when we talk about technologies of engagement, I 100% agree with Ariel and with also Fiona, and in this case also educational technology. I also think Bamsi, yeah, it was actually doing quite a right point. But when we talk, for instance, in my case also, I usually talk of technology of the engagement, technology of the education, technologies also of the support or planning support systems or design support systems, and also technologies of communication. So there are very different type of technologies there that it will demand a very different approach. In my case, in personally, I think in engagement, I think there is quite of a good movement because usually governments are the ones related. But when we go in technologies of design and how we can communicate with clients, there I think I find a very big gap. When clients are actually private sector, master plans, and people really with a very different type of, let's say, logics behind that are not for the greater good or for the public of the good. And I think that's a topic for a full other speaker workshop or whatever. But I think, yeah, I think this is actually really interesting, and I just enjoy a lot. And I'm going to take some of these names and I'm going to contact them later to keep doing this research.
Really nice. I think Fiona, when responding to facial expressions, I could say you definitely want to respond on this.
I always get this. People always say I have a very expressive face. I don't know. Maybe I've become.
That's very human.
I feel like it's become also more something just in the use of technology that we've got going right now in this kind of. I want to say strange new world, but it of course isn't. None of this is new. It's just at the moment maybe heightened in a way. But I have felt that this is something that the kind of the awareness that we have of self, just in this way of interacting, is a very different one. Just the fact that we see ourselves as we're talking to others constantly, which we're just not used to. I mean, I never used to sit around with a mirror as I'm talking to others. So I guess that is, it's another layer of kind of technology and self-awareness, obviously the things that I'm interested in. So that was slightly kind of outside of the conversation we're having, but it is one around kind of technology, I guess.
Yeah, that is really...
Maybe thanks, Father. Just to follow up on what Fiona said, 100%. I think this is exactly what we need to, 10 months into the pandemic, make sure we take the right things out of it moving forward. There was, I think, at least for the first 6 months, that somebody will write the history of the pandemic, but at least for the first 6 months, there was, at least in my echo chamber, an attempt to resort to this technological new world, right? Let's make virtual rooms, and let's go virtual, and let's be AR and VR all the time. And every other company in the Valley is starting a new startup that makes a table, which is not a table, it's a virtual table. Everything is a kind of imitation of reality. And I think the more we move forward, the more we see the limitations and the lack of these technologies to truly replace what we aspire for and need. Nevertheless,
No, continue. Sorry.
No, I was just about to say that nevertheless, there is something we can take, which is one thing to understand the limitation, which is an important lesson as much as the technology itself. But second is we do need a lot of technology these days. It's not as if it's not a 0 and 1, right? We might not replace our environment and our ability to meet other people. I would love to be in the same room with all of you now and have a real conversation, and then have a coffee and then a beer, and we're not going to do that. So it's not exactly the same.
It's a bit early for a beer where you are, maybe, or maybe not.
Well, it's Friday. It's Friday. It's always possible. But at the same time, I guess we do need quite a lot of understanding, and I kind of mentioned that in my talk, almost real-time understanding of our built environment, which is nothing to do with being virtual. It's being completely physical. But having this ability to really in real time assess and understand and sense our physical space is becoming more and more relevant and more crucial, because we're seeing changes we've never seen in the past. So I think this is something we can take from this moment in time.
Oh, definitely. And the thing is, it's even if we go back, which I hope we don't, as a kind of an opinion, I think that the hybrid is something that, and I use this for lack of a better term because it's not a novel term, obviously, but it's that this has changed profoundly the way that we interact, and we're not trying to escape that. I also think that the idea that you've just mentioned about replacing, this is something I think we all struggle with to an extent, is because it can't replace, but we might actually find ways of interacting, and we're indeed finding them already, because just as an example right here, in any kind of meeting, we have now the possibility of on the side having a chat where we're typing. So even the person who is talking right now, can contribute, but others can jump in as well. And in teaching and research, in any kind of meeting, this does open up a lot of possibilities of what we didn't have beforehand. The other thing that I'd like to raise is that Irene started her presentation with this kind of mention this idea of serendipity in the city. And this is something that, of course, the formats of interaction that we're confined to right now make very, very difficult, because it is that thing, once we all kind of log off, we go back to our lives and we don't go and have a coffee or go, let's go to the pub and have a chat afterwards, or we just kind of walk past each other and say, oh, by the way, in your talk, just this and this, and then bye. We walk past each other in offices. All of these unplanned moments, these things that emerge, or we kind of walk past that model that someone else is making going, that's cool, walk on. We haven't really even asked, but it's incited something in us. And I think that these are all things that we can't replace, but what other ways, or kind of what new ways of doing things might emerge, and how can we make this something that is helpful? And I mean, it's something we're already, again, back to my silly facial expressions. I think it's also because there's a lack of kind of sensory cues that we're getting from each other. And potentially it's something where, because I'm not sitting here, using my whole body to communicate, you don't see the subtleties of my gestures. So kind of maybe I'm trying to transport more or less successfully through my face, for example. And I think this is a very human thing, is we try and kind of reorganize the way that we interact with each other. So just a ramble, not going anywhere specific with it, but.
No, I think, but I think you're really right. I think we, to close up, because we have to take into account the time schedule, but I think this was a really interesting discussion, and you all agreed on we as a human being should position ourselves. So it's not only about the way we position ourselves, but it is more about that we should. Also then, at least what we agree on too, at least we don't have to go back, because we're all really striving for the future city, whatever it will be. So I want to thank you again for speaking up today. And I also want to invite you for our closing session. Ariel was already referring to these drinks and beers. Doesn't matter if it's an alcoholic
drink. I guess that's the only one everybody's going to remember from my talk.
Yeah, like, let's say this event is hosted by a Dutch university and we quite like a drink and a snack. So so I really want to invite you for the closing session. We will present the conclusions of today from this presentation and from the workshop at 3:50, so 10 before 4. And at 4:30, we have the definite closing ceremony from 4:30 to 5. So if you would like to join, you are invited to this, and you can also follow the conclusions. I think this probably would be nice. Great.
Thank you for the organization.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We really like to do it.
Ciao.
Okay,
Ciao.
thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So for people attending, we would like to invite you to and see you again at 3:15 for the workshop.